You know the story of Medusa, right? The famous creature with snake hair and a gaze that turns everything she touches to stone. But what if I told you that the truth behind this curse is much more complex than you think? Medusa wasn't always like this. She was actually a beautiful and devoted priestess with a normal life before she was transformed into a monster. And who was responsible for this? Well, the answer might surprise you. In this video, we will uncover the secrets behind Medusa's story, from her surprising origin to the betrayal of the gods who condemned her to a life of solitude and pain. Get ready to understand what led Athena, the goddess of wisdom, to make a fatal mistake, and how all of this set off a series of events that would change the fate of many. Stick with us until the end to discover the untold story of Medusa, where beauty turns into a curse and the true reason behind this legend is revealed. You'll be shocked. Don't miss a single detail. Let's get started. High on Mount Olympus, the gods watched intently as the dispute unfolded between Athena and Poseidon. Both wanted to be patrons of the new city of mortals, but only one could win. Zeus, sitting on his shining throne, decided that the inhabitants would choose the one who brought the most valuable gift. Poseidon, confident in his strength, went first. With a powerful strike of his trident, he cracked the earth and made a grand fountain spring forth. The water gushed forcefully, forming a small, shimmering lake. The mortals rushed to taste the gift of the sea god, but quickly spat out the bitter liquid. The water was salty, useless for drinking or irrigating crops. Then Athena approached with serenity. She touched the ground with the tip of her spear, and in an instant a sturdy trunk began to sprout. The roots spread firm, the branches rose, and in no time the world's first olive tree stood before the astonished eyes of the mortals. From its fruits they could make olive oil, food, and wood for building. A gift that was useful, lasting, and valuable. The inhabitants didn't hesitate. Athena won. Shouts of celebration echoed, and the city was named Athens in her honor. However, Poseidon did not forget the humiliation. His eyes gleamed like the sea before a storm. He didn't contest the judgment, but within his chest, a dark promise was born. One day he would take revenge on his niece. With the city now under her protection, Athena wanted to ensure that her presence would be felt by the mortals. So she ordered a grand temple to be built on the highest hill, a place where her wisdom and strength would be revered forever. To care for this sacred sanctuary, a group of devoted women began to serve her. They were her priestesses, chosen not only for their devotion, but also for their discipline and intelligence. As a sign of loyalty, they took a solemn vow of chastity and pledged to live only for Athena. The goddess believed that worldly desires weakened the mind and diverted one from the true path. For her, purity was not just of the body, but also of the heart and thoughts. Athena was proud of her followers. She saw in them reflections of her own essence, strong women, focused, who weren't swayed by passions or distractions. In the temple, everything was order, dedication, and respect for the goddess's values. No priestess dared question the rules, at least not until a certain point. Among all the devotees, there was one who stood out in a unique way, not just for her faith, but for something that caught the attention of even those who tried to ignore it, her beauty. Her name was Medusa. From the moment she stepped into the temple, Medusa drew attention. Her hair was long and shiny like strands of gold. Her skin seemed sculpted by the gods themselves, and her eyes had a hypnotic glow, like the sea at sunset. Her captivating presence made even the most serious individuals find themselves admiring her. The other priestesses respected her, but some couldn't help feeling a pang of envy. The men who visited the temple to make offerings would throw furtive glances, even knowing that Medusa was untouchable. And the more they tried to avoid her, the more irresistible she seemed to become. Despite everything, Medusa was loyal to Athena. Her heart belonged to the goddess, and she never once thought of breaking her vow. But she couldn't deny that her beauty attracted attention, and deep down, part of her liked it. However, what was fascination for some was danger for others. And among those who silently watched her, there was someone far more powerful and much more dangerous than any mortal. Poseidon. Medusa never disrespected Athena, but she wasn't blind to the impact she caused. She saw the admiring glances, felt the whispers around her, and even without meaning to, enjoyed the attention. When she passed by, the other priestesses would lower their eyes, while the visitors would avert their gaze too late. Sometimes she would find herself standing in front of the temple's bronze mirror, studying the details of her own face. She would touch her hair, smile lightly at the perfection of her features, and for a brief moment, feel more than just a simple priestess. She felt special. Athena, always vigilant, began to notice this subtle change. Proud and demanding, she didn't see beauty as a gift to be celebrated, but as a test. And Medusa was failing. Vanity was a dangerous trap, a weakness that could corrupt even the most devoted. Deep down, Athena didn't want to punish Medusa, but she saw her behavior as a deviation from her true mission. The temple was a place of devotion, not self-affirmation. A reminder was needed that faith came before anything else, before beauty, before the admiration of others, even before oneself. But before the goddess could act, fate would change Medusa's life forever. And Poseidon was about to strike the first blow. From high above in the realm of the seas, Poseidon watched. Since his defeat by Athena, he had held a grudge, and seeing his niece's temple thriving only deepened his frustration. But among the priestesses who served the goddess, one figure caught his attention in a different way: Medusa. Her beauty was unlike any other, even by divine standards. There was something in her that transcended physical appearance, an aura, a magnetism that made her impossible to ignore. Her face, her eyes, the graceful way she moved. Poseidon felt something stir inside him, a desire that mixed fascination and a longing to possess her. At first, he only watched from a distance. It was rare for a god to be so interested in a mortal, but Medusa was different. She shone in that temple like a star surrounded by shadows. As time passed, the idea of having her for himself became an obsession. And the more he realized that Medusa was untouchable, the more it intrigued him. Furthermore, hurting Medusa would be a direct blow to Athena, and Poseidon wanted revenge. Night fell over the temple, and Medusa, as usual, was alone, praying in silence, the soft sound of her voice blending with the wind whispering through the marble columns. The temple was at peace, but there was something in the air, a growing tension, as if something big and inevitable was about to happen. Poseidon knew the opportunity wouldn't come twice. He approached, unseen, using his powers to hide in the shadows, like the waves hiding beneath the calm surface of the sea. When he saw Medusa there, so pure and so unaware, something inside him trembled. It was a mixture of desire, revenge, and something deeper, something he couldn't fully understand, but that pulled him with uncontrollable force. With a swift movement, he appeared before her. Medusa, startled, tried to pull away, but she was trapped by the magic of the sea god, unable to escape. Her eyes shone with fierce intensity, a desire to flee, but Poseidon wouldn't let her. In an act that no god should ever commit inside a sacred temple, he violated her, desecrating the very place Athena treasured so much. Medusa, speechless, stood still, but her heart bled with pain and shame. She knew the act was irreversible, that nothing would ever be the same. Poseidon, after satisfying his own desires, disappeared into the dark waters, leaving Medusa behind. solitary and marked by a crime she never wished for. The pain was deep, but the weight of the guilt would fall, as always, on the wrong shoulders, and the greatest mistake of all would be Athena's. The sun rose the next day, but for Medusa, the light seemed darker than ever. She dragged herself through the temple corridors, her gaze empty, as if the pain had drained all the colors from her life. She could no longer look at herself, not even at the reflection of her face, which now seemed like that of a stranger. Soon, rumors began to spread among the priestesses. Poseidon's act, though a terrible crime, was quickly distorted. Some whispered that Medusa had provoked the god, that her beauty had been her undoing. Others spoke of a divine punishment, as if Medusa were somehow guilty, as if she had willingly surrendered to a god. The truth, however, seemed irrelevant. The weight of the guilt fell upon her with the force of a tidal wave. Athena, in her purity and pride, saw only the transgression of her priestess, without questioning the circumstances. The goddess, who had once seen Medusa as a symbol of devotion, now saw her as a stain on her sacred temple, a mistake that needed to be corrected harshly and without mercy. Medusa felt the reproachful gaze of everyone around her, as if Athena's words echoed in every corner of the temple. What had once been adoration had now turned into a silent condemnation. No one dared approach her, and the pain of loneliness began to consume her soul. The young woman who had once been worshipped as one of the most beautiful was now seen as a disgrace, not only to the temple, but to Athena herself. Yet the true weight of her guilt was not just the gaze of others, but the fact that she felt responsible for having attracted Poseidon's gaze, even though that gaze had never been desired. The truth, as always, was more complex than it seemed, but no one dared to see it. When Athena learned of what had happened, the shock was immediate but soon replaced by a cold fury. As a goddess of wisdom and justice, she could not tolerate transgressions in her domain, and that act committed within her temple was something that could not be ignored. However, the goddess had no proof that Medusa was a victim, and without a second thought, her judgment was clear. Medusa, in her weakness, had provoked Poseidon with her vanity and beauty. She could not stay there, staining the honor of the temple and of Athena herself. Athena gathered her priestesses and with a firm voice announced her decision. Medusa was to be banished and punished for her sin. Medusa, now consumed by pain and shame, knelt before her goddess, hoping for mercy, but she knew it would not be given. Athena, with her heart of stone and impassive gaze, offered no words of consolation. The decision was made. Medusa was to be expelled from the temple, and worse yet, she was to carry the mark of her failure for the rest of her days. The goddess wanted no more explanations or reasons. For Athena, there was no room for mercy. The mistake had been made, and an exemplary punishment needed to be carried out. It was a lesson for all who served the goddess. Beauty and vanity could not be tolerated. Medusa felt the weight of the decision falling on her shoulders. She knew she was being unjustly treated, but Athena's merciless gaze left no room for contestation. In Medusa's mind, something began to change. The world she knew, the world of devotion and purity, was collapsing, and a silent rage began to form in her heart. The goddess who had once been her protector was now the cause of her pain. As she left the temple, she felt the weight of shame and loneliness become unbearable. But even as she walked toward exile, a part of her knew that something far greater was coming. Medusa walked through the now empty temple corridors as if each step were a deep cut in her soul. As she exited the sacred space, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, as if every word from Athena, every reproachful glance followed her. She had been cast out, rejected by the very goddess to whom she had always devoted her life. The cold wind that surrounded her was no longer a comfort, but a cruel reminder of her fall. But the worst was yet to come. Athena, with her unrelenting heart, summoned Medusa to an isolated place, a sanctuary where the shadows seemed thicker than usual. There the goddess looked at Medusa, and the fury in her eyes shone brighter than any lightning. Athena did not forgive, and her punishment would be eternal. "Because of your vanity," Athena declared, her voice cutting like a blade. "You have become a symbol of corruption. Let your beauty now be your curse." In a swift movement, Athena raised her hand and with immense power transformed Medusa's long, beautiful hair into venomous snakes. Her eyes, which once reflected the sweetness of her soul, now became sources of terror. Any being who looked directly at her would be turned to stone, frozen by the sight of what had once been a pure goddess, now in monstrous form. Medusa screamed, but her voice was lost in the shadows. She looked at her hands, now covered in scales and thorns, and felt a wave of despair flood her chest. Athena, without a hint of regret, left her there alone, with her new form, her new identity. Now, Medusa was no longer the admired priestess. She was a creature feared and hated, rejected not only by society, but by the gods themselves. What remained was only a shadow of what she had been, a victim of a heartless goddess who in her pride could not see the suffering of the one who had once been her protector. Medusa was condemned to wander the world, alone and invisible, cursed, never to be seen except as a mortal threat. Medusa left, directionless, lost in the vast lands and seas that stretched before her. The temple, which had once been her home, now seemed a distant dream, like a life she could never return to. There was no place for her among men or gods. Her new appearance was so terrifying that anyone who crossed her path, hurried to flee or worse, was petrified by the mere sight of her eyes. The world that had once admired her now feared her. She had become a legend of terror, a monster with no place among the living. Medusa found refuge in an isolated cave in the heart of a forgotten land. There were no more sacred temples or prayers to be made. There was only solitude, silence, and the echo of her own pain. For days and nights, she wandered through the darkness, avoiding the gaze of all and, more painfully, avoiding her own reflection. Even the moon, which had once illuminated her beauty, seemed to mock her transformation. Time passed, but the pain did not lessen. Medusa, in her exile, no longer felt anger, only a vast emptiness. Every thought that crossed her mind was a reminder of her loss, the loss of her humanity, her beauty, her place in the world. She was condemned to live in the shadows, to wander as a shadow of herself, separated from everything and everyone. Loneliness was her only companion, and each day she became more of a legend, more of a story told to those who passed by her without ever seeing her. The world was lost to Medusa, and she was lost to the world. But even in the darkness, something in her heart did not die completely. Something small, but persistent, still made her wonder if maybe, one day, she could find a purpose beyond the pain. As Medusa sank deeper into the depths of her pain and loneliness, in another corner of the world, King Acrisius, ruler of Argos, was being haunted by an inevitable fate. An oracle, on a night of omens and mysteries, revealed to him a terrible prophecy. He would be killed by his own grandson. The king, terrified by the idea that the blood of his own lineage would be the cause of his death, began taking desperate measures to prevent it from happening. Acrisius knew the oracle never lied. The words of the oracle were always precise and could not be ignored. So, in an act of extreme protection, he decided to imprison his daughter, Danae, in a bronze tower, with no windows and no doors. He believed that by isolating her completely, he could prevent her from having children, thus preventing the birth of the grandson who, according to the prophecy, would end his life. But fate, as always, finds a way to escape. Even in the most foolproof plans, Zeus, the god of the sky and the most powerful among the gods, watched all of this from afar. He knew what was happening, and as he always did when he was drawn to a mortal, he could not resist. Disguised, he transformed into a golden shower that fell upon Danae while she was in her solitary prison. The warm and glowing rain penetrated the bronze walls, and Danae, not understanding what was happening, received Zeus in his divine form. The god impregnated her, and soon she conceived a son who, according to the prophecy, would cause Acrisios's death. When the king learned of his daughter's pregnancy, he was furious. He could no longer prevent the prophecy from coming true. Desperate to rid himself of his grandson, Acrisios made a final and ruthless decision. He ordered Danae and the baby to be placed in a wooden chest and cast into the sea, believing this would make them disappear forever. But, as fate is relentless and cannot be contained, even Acrisios' efforts could not change what was about to happen. The sea, vast as it was, swallowed the chest containing Danae and her son, but did not let them disappear. The waves, which seemed to want to push fate away, carried them to a small distant island known as Seriphos. The island was humble, without great riches, but it offered refuge and peace to those who arrived there. Danae, tired and desperate, saw the shore approaching as the chest floated gently until it finally touched the sand. She, fragile and exhausted, held her baby, Perseus, with all the strength she had left. The situation seemed hopeless, but there, in the unknown, something new was emerging, a chance, though fragile, of survival. On the island, a fisherman named Dictys found the chest while walking along the beach. Upon opening it, he found Danae and little Perseus, and the man's heart, pure and generous, could not resist. He took mother and child to his home, where Dictys's generosity was a beacon of hope for those who were adrift. He welcomed them as his family, offering them what he could, without questioning Danae's past, and unknowingly, perhaps, the weight of the fate now tied to little Perseus. The king of Seriphos, Polydectes, also heard of Danae and Perseus's arrival on the island, but he had no genuine interest in them. Polydectes, although appearing to be a just monarch, had his own interests, and upon seeing Danae's beauty, he began to desire her as his wife. However, there was one obstacle. Perseus, the young son of the woman he wanted to marry, was a constant reminder that she was unavailable. Polydectes then devised a plan to rid himself of Perseus and take Danae for himself. Unaware of the magnitude of the events that were about to unfold, Perseus' future and the impact he would have on the tragedies and victories of the human world were being shaped before his eyes. The boy, still small, didn't understand what was coming, but his fate was being traced by the hands of destiny and the gods. Life on the island of Seriphos seemed peaceful for Danae and her son Perseus, far from the threats of her past, but fate, as always, had other plans. Polydectes, the king of the island, began to approach Danae more frequently, showing his interest in her. Danae, still traumatized by the loss of everything she had and by the violence of her father, never reciprocated Polydectes' advances. She felt that although the island offered safety, she was at the mercy of someone who only wished to possess her, not love her. But the biggest obstacle for Polydectes was Perseus. The young boy, even though still a child, exuded the strength of Zeus' divine lineage, and his gaze was determined, like someone who was beginning to understand the weight of the world. Perseus silently protected his mother, and the king knew that as long as Perseus was there, he couldn't get close to Danae in the way he desired. It was then that Polydectes had an idea, a way to get rid of Perseus, and at the same time ensure his mother would be vulnerable to him. The king, wanting to rid himself of the boy, summoned Perseus for an impossible mission, to bring back the head of the fearsome Medusa. He knew that Perseus, with his determined spirit, would not be able to accomplish such a feat. Medusa was a monstrous creature with snake-like hair and a gaze capable of turning any living being to stone. Polydectes believed the mission would be certain death for young Perseus. He had no idea that behind the boy's courage was something much greater than just an attempt to please the king. Perseus was about to embark on a journey that would lead him to face not only monsters and challenges, but his own inner strength and his destiny, which connected him to the gods. Danae, upon hearing of the challenge given to her son, was desperate. She knew that Perseus was going after something he probably wouldn't return to talk about, but even with the fear in her heart, she knew that his fate was intertwined with something greater, something she could not control. It was as if the gods themselves were conspiring to place her son on a path to a grand future, even if it meant risking his life. With one last tight embrace and a look filled with love and concern, Danae saw Perseus depart, not knowing that his journey would change the course of history forever. Perseus set off on his journey, but fate had a much bigger plan for him than he could imagine. The crossing of the sea was long and full of uncertainties, but the gods, as always, were watching over the young hero. His journey took him to distant lands, and it was in one of these places that Perseus found his first true ally. On a small northern island, Perseus was rescued by an old man, a wise sage known as the Old Wizard, who had a deep knowledge of the gods and their schemes. He was on the brink of death, but upon seeing Perseus, the old man's eyes sparkled as if life had been restored. He knew that the young hero possessed something not many had, a pure heart and the courage to fight the impossible. With the teachings of the old man, Perseus became more than just a warrior. He began to understand the true essence of his destiny. The ancient words and wisdom imparted by the wizard transformed him into a stronger being, more capable of facing the dangers that awaited him. However, time was against him, as the mission to kill Medusa still loomed on the horizon. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Seriphos, King Polydectes, who had expected Perseus's failure, prepared his own scheme. Polydectes had underestimated the young man, thinking his boldness would be his downfall. But as the months passed and Perseus did not return, the king began to realize that the boy's mission was not something simple. Polydectes didn't know that the gods were favoring Perseus, granting him powers he never imagined he possessed. Danae, in her anguish, waited for news of her son. Her heart was broken with worry, but she also knew that Perseus was no longer the same. He was destined for something grand. And though fear consumed her, part of her believed he was the hero the prophecy had promised. Unknowingly, he was destined not only to face Medusa, but to rewrite the very history of the gods. Fate was acting, and nothing could stop him. After days and nights facing the turbulent seas and crossing unknown lands, Perseus finally reached the land of monsters. He knew that the mission Polydectes had given him was practically impossible, but his determination to keep his word and save his mother kept him firm. Perseus did not fully understand the power he carried inside him, but he knew that in some way he was more prepared than he had ever imagined. In the silence of a dark cave, deep within those desolate lands, Perseus encountered the first signs of the journey he was about to undertake. He was approached by three mysterious figures, the Graces, three sisters who had the ability to see what no one else could. They looked at him with a mix of curiosity and respect, knowing he was on a mission that would change the course of his life and history. They gave him the first gift, a sharp sword, forged with the power of the gods, capable of cutting through even the hardest stones. Without it, Perseus would never be able to face Medusa. As he tried to understand the significance of the sword, a new ally appeared on his path, Hermes, the messenger of the gods. With a mischievous smile, He handed Perseus the second gift, winged sandals, which would allow him to fly. But Hermes didn't stop there. He knew the young hero would need something more to face Medusa. There is a way to look at Medusa without being turned to stone. You must use the reflection, said Hermes, handing him a polished shield, shinier than any metal Perseus had ever seen. With this, you can look at Medusa without falling under her power. The task still seemed impossible, but with each gift from the gods, Perseus felt a new strength growing within him. He was more prepared for what lay ahead than he had imagined, and so with his sword, winged sandals and shield in hand, Perseus set off for Medusa's cave. He knew that the battle against the monstrous creature would not just be physical. The challenge would also be to face his own fears, because Medusa wasn't just a physical monster. She represented everything he feared: death, failure, darkness. With the gods' gifts and the courage flowing through his veins, Perseus began the journey that would lead him to the most important confrontation of his life. As Perseus approached the cave where Medusa and her sisters, the Gorgons, resided, he felt the weight of the mission crushing him like a rock. The dense, dark forest around him seemed to pulse strangely, as if the gods themselves were watching every step he took. He knew that, even with the sharp sword, winged sandals and shield, the real battle would be against Medusa's deadly gaze. Each step brought him closer to a confrontation with fate and with death itself, and it was at this moment, when the tension was at its peak, that the gods decided to intervene once again. The first goddess to manifest was Athena, who appeared to Perseus in a clear vision, bright as a lightning bolt. She, who had cast Medusa into the abyss of her own curse, now offered crucial advice. Remember, Perseus, that you must use the reflection, not look directly into Medusa's eyes. Look at what the mirror of your shield shows, and victory will be yours. She spoke with a silent wisdom, as if she already knew that the young hero had within him the potential to overcome adversity. It was a precious tip, but also a reminder of how difficult the task would be. In her heart, Athena knew that Medusa's redemption, the transformation of her own anger into a monster, had led the creature to this point of destruction and death. She could not undo what had been done, but she saw in Perseus the chance to correct a past mistake. It was her last opportunity to fix what had gone so wrong. Soon after, Hermes appeared again. With his irreverent smile, he handed Perseus the third and final gift he would need for the mission: a helmet of invisibility, shaped from the most powerful spells, allowing the wearer to disappear before anyone's eyes. This helmet will allow you to approach Medusa without being seen. But remember, hero, there is no room for error. Use the shield to see Medusa's reflection and cut off her head with the sword. There is no space for hesitation. Blessed. With these gifts from the gods, Perseus felt more prepared, but the responsibility on his shoulders weighed like a mountain. He knew he couldn't fail. His mother Danae's life was in his hands, and her future was entwined with Medusa's death. Looking at the gods' gifts, he felt a growing inner strength. He wasn't just a young man seeking a goal. He was the hero chosen by the gods, and now he had the tools to face the monstrosity ahead. With the winged sandals on his feet, the reflective shield in his hands, the sharp sword, and the helmet of invisibility, Perseus entered the cave with renewed courage. He knew time was running out and there would be no second chance. The gods were on his side. What would happen next, no one knew. But Perseus was ready to face the greatest challenge of his life. The cave was dark and silent, a place where the air felt dense and saturated with a sense of imminent death. Perseus, with the helmet of invisibility covering his head, moved carefully. His winged sandals guided him silently over the rocky floor, but the weight of his mission made him feel as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. As he advanced, the cave's darkness seemed to intensify. In a distant corner, he heard the sound of something heavy crawling, the rustling of a monstrous creature that could only be Medusa. His eyes began adjusting to the dimness, and that's when he saw the figure he had feared, Medusa. She stood still, almost in a trance, her hair of snakes writhing and hissing, emitting a horrible and unsettling sound. Each snake seemed alive, moving independently, as if they had a mind of their own. The reflection on the cave's walls revealed her monstrosity in all its terrifying form, and Perseus felt a chill run down his spine. Medusa, though monstrous, seemed to be a shadow of her former beauty. There was sadness in her petrified eyes, as if she knew she could never escape her own curse. Perseus didn't feel fear, but rather a strange empathy, as if, for a moment, he were facing someone who had already been the victim of an injustice, far greater than he could comprehend. But the fear was soon replaced by the coldness of his goal. He couldn't hesitate. With his shield, Perseus looked at Medusa's reflection, avoiding looking directly at her. He knew that if he looked into her eyes, he would be turned to stone, like all the others. Every movement he made was calculated, precise. He observed Medusa's reflection and slowly approached, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Medusa, seemingly unaware of his presence, was absorbed in her own pain. But her snakes sensed Perseus. They began to move frantically, attacking, but he was protected by the helmet of invisibility, and they couldn't find him. With a swift movement, Perseus raised the sword, aiming for the creature's neck. Medusa, sensing the danger, turned toward where he should be, but it was too late. The strike was precise. The sword cut off Medusa's head with divine accuracy, and the sound of the rupture echoed through the cave. From Medusa's body, an explosion of energy erupted, and one of mythology's greatest mysteries was revealed. From her decapitated head, a winged horse, Pegasus, was born. The creature flapped its powerful wings and took flight, beginning a new legend. Perseus looked at the horse in astonishment, but knew he couldn't stop there. His mission wasn't over. He looked one last time at Medusa's head, now completely still, and felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The mission was complete, but the fate of everyone involved would never be the same. The moment Perseus cut off Medusa's head wasn't just marked by the sound of steel striking the monstrous creature's flesh. The impact of his strike reverberated, and something unexpected happened. From Medusa's body, something magical and extraordinary began to emerge. An explosion of light and strength, followed by a pair of enormous wings beating against the air with a powerful sound. Perseus looked at what was emerging and was stunned. From the decapitated head of Medusa, a winged horse appeared, with a celestial glow emanating from its wings. It was enormous and of unmistakable beauty, its wing feathers shining like silver under the soft light of the cave. The winged horse was Pegasus, one of the most mythical creatures of Greece, and it stood before Perseus as a symbol of power and freedom. The first thing Perseus noticed was the aura of nobility and majesty emanating from Pegasus. The horse, with its large, dark eyes and calm expression, seemed unafraid, despite emerging from such a dark event. The creature gazed at the hero as if it recognized his importance in the story being written, and then, with a graceful movement, took flight. That vision, the sight of the winged horse soaring into the sky and disappearing into the heights, was not just a spectacle of beauty. It was a symbol of transformation and rebirth. Medusa, in her death, had given birth to new life, a mythical being that would cross the skies with the grace of a god. The birth of Pegasus also represented the possibility of new paths for all involved in that story. Perseus watched Pegasus disappear into the clouds, feeling a silent connection with the horse, as if he knew this winged creature would play an important role in his future journey. However, he couldn't linger. Medusa was dead, and he still needed to fulfill his destiny. He placed the Gorgon's head into a special sack, protected by the magic of the invisibility helmet, and began his journey back to the world of the living. But the road was far from simple. Perseus knew he now held a formidable power in his hands, something that could change the course of history, and although he had achieved a great feat, the hero knew that new challenges awaited him. Perseus's journey back was not peaceful. Although his mission was accomplished and he had Medusa's head safely with him, the hero felt the weight of his journey intensifying. The air seemed thicker as he neared the sea, and fatigue began to take its toll. But he knew his mother, Danae, was still in danger, and he couldn't stop until he freed her from the threat looming over her. As he flew with the help of the winged sandals, Perseus spotted a beautiful coast where the salty sea breeze mixed with the sound of crashing waves. He didn't know exactly where he was, but a sense of urgency led him to descend. When he landed, he found a scene that would make any heart tighten. By the sea, a young woman was chained to a rock. Her long golden hair floated in the wind, and her body, though strong, appeared weary from the struggle against the cruel prison she was in. She was alone, at the mercy of fate, and the waves were approaching with growing force. The woman was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, and her sacrifice was about to be fulfilled. Perseus observed closely. He knew the young woman was there to be devoured by a sea monster, a giant creature sent by Poseidon to punish her mother's vanity. But now, death was about to claim its price. The monster was already approaching, a monstrous shadow rising. From the sea, with eyes like flames and scales gleaming with a sinister light, the hero did not hesitate. He had no time to waste. With a cry of determination, Perseus raised Medusa's head, still with him, and pointed it toward the approaching creature. The sea monster, upon seeing the petrified reflection of the Gorgon, immediately froze. It tried to move but couldn't. Its eyes were fixed and its body turned to stone, just like anyone touched by Medusa's gaze. Andromeda, who had been resigned to death, now watched in astonishment as the creature turned into a colossal statue. Frozen forever, she was free. Perseus, the hero who had saved her, flew to her with Pegasus, who was now approaching with his majesty. Andromeda, with tears in her eyes, looked at the hero. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice heavy with gratitude. Perseus smiled, though. He knew the true battle was yet to come. "You shouldn't just thank me. Thank all the gods who helped me on this mission. Now you're free." With a gentle gesture, Perseus freed her from the chains, and together they left. The young woman, now saved, knew her life had been returned to her by the bravery of a hero. And Perseus, in turn, knew he had fulfilled his mission, but that destiny still called him. The road home would not be easy, but he had a new purpose. Andromeda was now part of his story, and he was determined to ensure she lived without the burden of death that had nearly claimed her. Perseus and Andromeda continued their journey to Seriphos, where the threat he had left behind still lingered. King Polydectes, who had manipulated Perseus into seeking Medusa's head, now believed he would finally get what he wanted: Danae, Perseus's mother, as his wife. He didn't know the hero had returned with the greatest trophy possible, something that could change everything. When Perseus and Andromeda arrived on the island, the atmosphere was tense. Polydectes, confident in his power, was throwing a party in his palace, celebrating what he thought was his victory. All the subjects of Seriphos had gathered, and the king was about to announce his marriage to Danae. But Perseus no longer had patience for games or manipulations. He knew he needed to act to save his mother and end once and for all the tyrant who had threatened them. Using Medusa's head, still in its sack, Perseus entered the hall where the party was taking place. The doors opened, and the hero entered with an imposing air, his gaze firm. When Polydectes saw Perseus, an arrogant smile appeared on his face. He believed the hero had failed, and now he had the chance to humiliate him publicly. "So, Perseus, where's your great achievement?" Polydectes mocked. "Did you bring Medusa's head, or did the monster defeat her before you got here?" Perseus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took the sack from his belt and opened it slowly. The sound of something heavy and macabre echoed through the hall. All eyes were on him. And then Perseus raised the Gorgon's head, making Medusa's petrified eyes reflect the light of the lamps in the hall. The moment Polydectes looked into the creature's eyes, he couldn't help it. His body began to transform, and before he could scream or try to move, he was completely turned to stone. The party, which had once been filled with laughter and joy, was silenced completely, and all present were frozen. Witnessing the fall of their tyrannical king, Polydectes' body remained there, rigid and motionless, a statue that represented the punishment he deserved for his actions. The subjects, now freed from the king's rule, began to approach Perseus in respect and gratitude, but the hero, without wasting time, went straight to his mother. "Danae, finally, we're free," Perseus said, looking at his mother, who was in shock but immensely relieved. Danae ran to him, hugging him tightly. She knew that now, with Polydectes out of the picture, her life and her son's life would be different. They could finally live in peace. However, Perseus knew that this victory was just one chapter in the long journey ahead. He had defeated Polydectes, but the weight of responsibility still rested on his shoulders. His journey would lead him to other challenges, but now he had Andromeda by his side and the support of his mother. Once again he had won, and now the future was clearer. The hero of Seriphos would also become a hero whose name would spread across the world. Perseus never imagined that his victory over Polydectes was just the beginning of something much larger. The celebration of his achievement was brief, for something he could not foresee was about to happen. After freeing his mother and ensuring her safety, Perseus felt the pieces of destiny still moving in a way he couldn't control. It was then that the discus throw competition was announced, a common event that took place in Greek cities to honor the gods and test the physical abilities of young heroes. Perseus, who now found himself in Seriphos as a respected man, was invited to participate. It was a chance for him to demonstrate his skill and perhaps to continue proving that his courage and abilities were unmatched. However, what he didn't know was that this competition was about to become the scene of a prophecy's fulfillment. Something he had heard about but never imagined would come true in such a cruel way. Among the participants was an old man who observed Perseus with a serious expression, a man whose name was Acrisius. He was the king of Argos, and although he did not know it, he was about to see the fate of his own life sealed because of a long-forgotten connection. Many years before, Acrisius had learned of the prophecy that said he would be killed by his daughter Danae's son. Fearing this prediction, the king had done everything he could to prevent it from happening, including imprisoning his daughter and keeping her away from all men. However, as everyone knows, fate cannot be escaped. Perseus, unaware of Acrisius' identity, was now standing before his grandfather, the man who had lived for years with the fear that his death would come from his own family. The discus throw competition began, and Perseus, with the same skill he had used to defeat monsters and enemies, prepared to throw the discus with his impressive strength. He hurled it with all his energy, his mind focused on the movement, the tension, and expectation. Hanging in the air, the discus flew far, but unexpectedly, its trajectory veered off course and, in a tragic move, the discus struck Acrisius with a fatal impact. He fell to the ground, lifeless, before the astonished eyes of everyone present. Perseus couldn't believe what had just happened. He had killed a man unintentionally, and this man unknowingly was his grandfather. The weight of the prophecy, which had seemed so distant, had now come to pass in a tragic way. Acrisius had been killed by his own grandson, just as the oracle had predicted many years before. Shock overtook the hero. The sense of guilt and the weight of destiny bore down on him in an overwhelming way. He had done nothing to prevent the tragedy, but somehow the burden of fate seemed to leave him no escape. Perseus, although still devastated, knew that the prophecy had been fulfilled. His heart was heavy, but he understood that the cycle of fate, no matter how cruel, could not be interrupted. The hero now found himself faced with a moral and existential dilemma: how to deal with what had been done. But when he looked at Andromeda by his side, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, amidst the chaos of fate, there was still a path to redemption. Perseus' story was far from over. Though he had fulfilled the prophecy and freed his mother, the weight of past actions still haunted him. However, elsewhere, the gods watched the consequences of their own decisions. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, could not ignore what had happened to Medusa, and guilt now weighed on her like a shadow. From the moment she turned Medusa into a monstrous creature, Athena had convinced herself that the punishment was just. She believed Medusa deserved condemnation for being vain, and despite her beauty, disrespecting the sacred temple. Athena knew that Medusa had once been a faithful priestess, but at the same time, the young woman's vanity seemed something she could not tolerate. To Athena, beauty was a gift from Apollo, and no one could use it to stray from their sacred purpose. However, as time passed, the goddess began to reflect on the harshness of her decision. She knew that Medusa had not asked for the situation that befell her, especially the brutal violence committed by Poseidon. Medusa, at her core, was a victim of circumstances, and Athena realized this too late. The transformation of the young woman into a monstrosity, her exile, and the loss of her humanity, all of this was beyond what any goddess should have imposed. Medusa not only lost her beauty, but also the chance to live a dignified life. Athena began to realize that she had acted out of anger and pride, and the burden of this mistake began to consume the goddess of wisdom. Upon learning that Perseus had completed his mission and brought Medusa's head, Athena felt deep remorse. She could not undo the harm she had caused, but she knew her lack of compassion had been a grievous flaw. She had become complicit in an injustice, for Medusa did not deserve to be condemned in the way she had been. And worse still, the goddess knew that the beauty Medusa possessed was not a sin, but a gift. She should have been wiser, more compassionate. In response, Athena decided to act so as not to forget this error. She ordered the creation of a bronze shield with an image of Medusa engraved on it. The face of the Gorgon, with its petrifying eyes and snake hair, now adorned the shield as a constant reminder of Athena's failure. She knew this would serve as a lesson for both gods and mortals, that even those who are most powerful can err. It was a way to remind everyone that wisdom is not only about power or rigid justice, but also about compassion and understanding circumstances. The goddess of wisdom, though she had chosen the path of punishment, now began to regret her decision and sought in some way to redeem what had been lost. The image of Medusa on the shield would be the symbol of her change in perspective, and a way to remind that above all, both gods and mortals must always seek the wisdom that comes from empathy and forgiveness. But Medusa's story was still not entirely over. Her image, now emblazoned on Athena's shield, carried a much deeper meaning than anyone could have imagined. Even after her death, the Gorgon would remain present in the memories of both mortals and immortals, as an eternal reminder that sometimes the greatest mistakes are the hardest to correct. The story of Medusa, Perseus, and Athena, filled with intertwined fates and divine choices, eventually became an epic about the limits of power, the weight of decisions, and the lessons that come from mistakes. When the winds of history finally settle, what remains is the profound reflection on the actions of the gods and the mortals who challenge them. Medusa, the young priestess who had been turned into a monster, was not simply a victim, but a symbol. Her tragic fate was not just a punishment for the sin of vanity, but a reflection of the complexity of human and divine nature. Athena, even as the goddess of wisdom, made a terrible mistake in judging her without seeing Medusa's true story. And this flaw, though painful, became a powerful lesson. Medusa's transformation and subsequent death were not just the destruction of a life, but the breaking of an ideal. The idea that the gods were beyond the reach of failure. Perseus, for his part, was a hero forged in the fire of destiny. He not only faced monsters, but also carried the burden of an unrelenting prophecy. Yet even without knowing his true connection to Acrisius, the king he had just killed, he fulfilled what had been imposed on him. By doing so, he brought to light the idea that destinies cannot be avoided, no matter how much the actions of men and gods try to challenge them. Perseus, with his courage, found a way to deal with the consequences of his actions, but he could never escape the truth of fate. The true lesson, however, came from understanding that behind all the grand narratives and heroic feats, there was a universal humanity. Athena, despite her immortality and her role as the guardian of wisdom, was susceptible to pride and error, just like any mortal. Medusa, with all her beauty and suffering, was transformed by something beyond her control. And Perseus, with his bravery and pure heart, still found himself swept away by a greater force, the inevitability of what was meant to happen. In the end, the moral of the story was clear. The gods may be wise, but they are also vulnerable. Pride can blind even the most powerful, and vanity can lead to destruction. However, true wisdom doesn't lie in punishment, but in understanding, and true strength isn't just about winning battles, but learning from them. Mistakes are not a permanent stain, but a starting point for reflection and change. The story of Medusa and the gods teaches us that, in the end, what matters isn't what we are capable of destroying or conquering, but what we learn from tragedies and the mistakes of the past. Perhaps by understanding the flaws of others and our own, we can build a wiser, more compassionate future, and perhaps a less fatalistic one. Destiny is relentless, but how we choose to deal with it is what defines who we are, whether gods or mortals. And so the legend of Medusa and Perseus, with all its twists and lessons, remains alive as an eternal tale, reminding everyone that, in the end, the true victories come from humility, regret, and the understanding that everyone, even the gods, make mistakes. So, guys, what did you think of this epic story of Medusa, Perseus, and the gods? A true lesson in wisdom, regret, and of course, destiny. The journey teaches us so much about the flaws of immortals and the lessons we can learn from mistakes, right? If you enjoyed this content and want more stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button below. If there's something you'd like to comment about the story or an opinion about the gods and their mistakes, share it with us in the comments. We love hearing what you think. And of course, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss any updates. We've got plenty more fascinating stories and mythology lessons coming your way. See you in the next video, folks.